There's a silent question that might be controlling your entire life right now. And the scariest thing is that you may never have realized it. Because while you believe you're making conscious decisions, choosing paths, trying to change your reality, there's a hidden image inside your mind deciding what you deserve to live. And no matter how many books you read, how many goals you write, how many times you try to start over, if that image remains the same, your life always finds a way to return to the same place. Have you noticed how some people seem to repeat the same relationships, the same failures, the same emotional cycles, even when desperately trying to change? It's not bad luck. It's not a coincidence. There's an invisible force operating behind your personality, your habits, and even the way you interpret the world. That force is your self-image. And maybe you think self-image is just how you see yourself in the mirror. But no. Self-image is the secret identity you've built for yourself throughout your life. It's the silent concept that defines how much love you accept, how much money you believe you deserve, the level of happiness you can bear to live with, and even the size of the dreams you allow to exist within you. And most people never change their lives because they try to change reality without first changing this internal image. It's like painting the walls of a house while the structure continues to rot inside. Sooner or later, everything crumbles again. Since childhood, you've been programmed without realizing it. Small comments, glances, rejections, comparisons, painful experiences, all of this has formed an internal narrative. Perhaps someone made you believe you weren't intelligent enough. Perhaps you grew up feeling you needed to please everyone to be loved. Perhaps you learned that making mistakes was dangerous, that dreaming was arrogance, that happiness was short-lived. And the problem is that the human brain doesn't differentiate very well between reality and emotional repetition. What you heard many times, what you felt many times, began to seem true. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it destiny. And that's exactly what happens with self-image. It becomes invisible. You no longer realize you're acting based on it. You just believe that that's how it is. You say, I'm shy, I always fail, nobody values me and I can't change, as if you were describing absolute facts. But most of the time, you're just describing an emotional identity that has been conditioned within you. And here begins something disturbing. Your mind works every day to prove that your self-image is right. If you believe you don't deserve love, you will unconsciously accept emotional crumbs. If you believe you will never succeed, you will sabotage opportunities without realizing it. If you believe you are not important, you will diminish your own voice in any environment. The brain seeks internal coherence. It prefers to remain in a known, painful identity, rather than enter unknown territory where it would need to transform. That's why so many people feel fear when they begin to evolve. It seems contradictory, but growing up is scary, because every change threatens the old identity. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life feeling invisible. When she starts receiving recognition, a part of her feels discomfort. When someone praises her, she downplays it. When an opportunity arises, she procrastinates. Because deep down there's a voice saying, this doesn't suit me. And it's at this point that many people destroy their own happiness without realizing it. Not because they want to suffer, but because the mind tries to protect the identity it considers safe. Perhaps now you're beginning to realize how many decisions in your life stemmed from an internal image that you didn't even consciously choose. And that changes everything, because it means that many of the limitations that seem real may just be emotional stories repeated for so long that they've become a prison. Think of a person who spent years hearing that they would never be able to succeed in life. Even when opportunities arise, they already enter defeated. They already expect rejection. They already expect failure. And then their behavior changes. Their posture changes. Their energy changes. They speak differently, act differently, hesitate more. And in the end, they create exactly the result they feared most. Not because the universe hates them, but because their self-image shaped their actions. Psychology calls this a self-fulfilling prophecy. You believe in something deeply, act accordingly, and then use the result as proof that you were right. The cycle closes, and the more it repeats, the stronger the identity becomes. Now imagine the impact of this on all areas of life. In relationships, for example, how many people say they want true love, but carry within themselves, do they believe they are not enough? They live constantly seeking validation. They fear abandonment. They accept humiliating situations. And sometimes they even push away good people because they can't believe that someone could truly love them. The problem was never just the relationship. It was the silent self-image saying, This is the most you deserve. And perhaps the most painful part is realizing that many people spend decades trying to change the outside while completely ignoring the inside. They change jobs, cities, partners, appearance, but continue to carry the same emotional identity. And then life seems to repeat the same patterns with different faces. There's an old Stoic saying that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And this explains why two people can live through similar experiences and interpret them in completely different ways. Criticism can destroy someone who feels inadequate, while another person sees it only as a learning experience. Failure can make someone give up on life, while another uses it as fuel to grow. The difference isn't just in the situation, it's in the inner identity. It's in the self-image, because it functions as an invisible filter. You interpret reality based on what you believe it to be. And perhaps that's why so many people live emotionally exhausted, because they are trying to sustain a life incompatible with their own inner identity. They want prosperity, but feel small. They want freedom, but see themselves as incapable. They want peace, but identify with suffering. And here there is something even deeper. Your self-image doesn't just affect your mind, it affects your body, your energy, and even how people react to you. Neuroscience shows that repeated thoughts create increasingly stronger neural connections. In other words, the more you reinforce an identity, the more automatic it becomes. Your brain literally adapts to what you believe about yourself. And then something strange begins to happen. You no longer need to think consciously. Behavior becomes automatic. Insecurity becomes automatic. Procrastination becomes automatic. Self-sabotage becomes automatic. It's as if your life is being driven by an invisible program installed years ago. And perhaps the most frightening thing is realizing that many people die without ever questioning this program. But there comes a moment in life when something awakens. Sometimes it's intense pain. Sometimes it's an inexplicable emptiness. Sometimes you achieve everything you thought you wanted, and yet you still feel incomplete. And at that moment, a powerful question is born. Who am I really behind this identity that has been built around me? This question can change an entire life because it opens space for awareness, and awareness is the beginning of freedom. While you live on autopilot, your self-image controls everything. But when you start observing your patterns, something changes. You realize that many thoughts are not absolute truths. They are just repetitions, emotional echoes, old conditioning. Perhaps now you are remembering specific moments in your life, situations where you diminished yourself, opportunities you abandoned before even trying, relationships where you accepted less than you deserved, dreams you buried because they seemed too impossible. And perhaps you are beginning to understand that the greatest limitation was never entirely in the external world. It was in the internal image you carried of yourself, and that's not your fault, because nobody is born hating themselves. Nobody is born believing they don't deserve love. These ideas were built up slowly, but there's a huge difference between not being guilty and remaining unconscious, because from the moment you perceive the pattern, a new responsibility arises, the responsibility to rebuild who you believe you are. And here's something almost nobody teaches. You don't change your self-image just by repeating positive phrases in the mirror. True transformation happens when new emotional experiences begin to challenge the old identity. The brain learns much more through emotion than through logic. It's not enough to say, "I am capable," if emotionally you continue to feel small. That's why change requires conscious practice. It requires small actions aligned with the identity you want to build. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life believing their voice doesn't matter. The transformation begins when they speak, even when feeling afraid. When they take a stand, even when trembling inside. Each small action sends a new signal to the brain. Little by little, the old identity begins to weaken. And you know what's curious? Often the world reacts differently when your self-image changes. Not because of magic, but because your presence changes. Your energy changes, your posture changes. People who once intimidated you cease to seem that way. Giants. Situations that once paralyzed you begin to seem smaller. You stop begging for validation. You stop accepting crumbs. You stop trying to convince the world of your own worth, because you finally begin to feel that worth within yourself. And that changes everything. Nietzsche said that he who has a why can bear almost any how. But few people can sustain a true purpose while carrying an identity based on fear and inadequacy. There is also a dangerous trap that ensnares many people: identification with pain. Some people have spent so much time suffering that suffering has become part of their identity. They no longer know who they would be without anxiety, without drama, without emotional chaos. And then they unconsciously begin to recreate painful situations because it seems familiar. It seems strange to think about it, but the human brain prefers known pain to unknown happiness. That's why change is so scary. Because change requires symbolically dying to an old version of oneself, and the ego resists. The ego prefers to maintain predictable, even destructive patterns. If this makes sense to you so far, perhaps it's because some part of you has already realized that you can no longer continue living on autopilot. And at this moment, I want to ask you something. Observe how many people watch content like this in silence, trying to understand their own minds, trying to rebuild themselves from within, but few actually decide to consciously begin this transformation. So if this video is awakening something in you, if it's making you see parts of your life that previously seemed invisible, take advantage now and subscribe to the channel. Because here, each reflection is an attempt to break these internal prisons that most people don't even realize they carry. And perhaps the next video will be exactly the missing piece for you to understand something even deeper about yourself. Now pay attention to this. Self-image also controls what you tolerate. People with low self-image tend to tolerate disrespect, toxic environments, and destructive relationships because deep down they believe that this is normal for them. Have you noticed how some people constantly enter into relationships where they have to beg for attention, or remain in environments that completely drain their energy? Often it's not a lack of intelligence, it's emotional identity. They've learned to associate love with pain, presence with abandonment, value with suffering, and then they confuse emotional intensity with true connection. Carl Rogers, one of the greatest humanistic psychologists in history, said that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change. And that's extremely profound, because many people try to change by hating themselves. They try to evolve by feeling insufficient. But true transformation begins when you look at yourself with awareness instead of judgment. This doesn't mean complacency. It means stopping building change based on self-loathing. Because when you hate yourself, any evolution becomes a desperate attempt to prove your worth. And that never brings true peace. There's a gigantic difference between growing through self-love and growing through feelings of inadequacy. Those who grow trying to fill an inner void never feel sufficient. They achieve something and soon need more. They receive recognition and remain insecure. Because the problem was never just the lack of external results. The problem was in identity. And perhaps this explains why some people seemingly have everything and remain emotionally destroyed. Money doesn't heal a broken self-image. Fame doesn't heal a broken self-image. Relationships don't heal a broken self-image. Because when identity remains wounded, any achievement loses its ability to fill the void. And here comes a very interesting concept from depth psychology. Your unconscious always tries to protect what it considers your true identity. If deep down you believe you are being rejected, you will begin to interpret neutral signals as rejection. If you believe you are not important, any lack of attention will seem like confirmation of that. The brain selects information compatible with your internal beliefs, and then you start living in a distorted reality without realizing it. It's like wearing invisible glasses that alter how you see the world. And the worst part is that you usually don't even question these glasses. You just believe that this is the absolute reality. Now imagine what happens when someone begins to consciously rebuild their own self-image. The person starts to act differently, speaks differently, chooses differently. They begin to understand that they don't need to eternally carry the identity created by pain. And perhaps this is one of the most liberating ideas you'll hear today. You are not obligated to continue being the person you needed to exist to survive in the past. Many versions. Your behaviors were born simply as defense mechanisms. Excessive fear, the need to please, difficulty trusting, self-sabotage. All of this may have been useful at some point in your life, but survival is not the same as living fully. And do you know what else prevents people from changing? The daily repetition of the same internal narrative. The way you talk to yourself slowly shapes your identity. Imagine waking up every day feeding thoughts of failure, inadequacy, and fear. Little by little, this becomes emotional reality. And then your energy begins to match that narrative. That's why awareness is so important. You need to start observing the internal dialogue that sustains your current identity, because repeated thoughts become beliefs. Beliefs become behaviors. Behaviors become destiny. There's a powerful metaphor for this. Imagine your mind is a garden. Everything you water grows. If you water insecurity daily, it flourishes. If you constantly water fear, it dominates the terrain. But if you consciously begin to cultivate courage, presence, and self-worth, little by little, the scenario changes. The problem is that many people want to harvest flowers while continuing to nurture emotional weeds every day. They want peace while feeding destructive thoughts. They want transformation without changing the identity that sustains their current reality. And perhaps now comes the most important question of this entire video. Who would you be without the stories they told about you? Without the labels? Without the experiences that made you doubt your own worth? Close your eyes for a moment and think about this deeply. How many versions of yourself never came to be because you believed too early that you weren't capable? How many opportunities died in your mind before they even existed in the real world? How many dreams were suffocated by your old identity? This reflection hurts, but it also awakens, because it shows that perhaps there is a whole life waiting on the other side of the transformation of your self-image. And at this point, I want to ask you a sincere question. What belief about yourself has most limited your life so far? Maybe it's, I'm never enough. Maybe it's, nobody understands me. Maybe, I always mess everything up. Write that in the comments. Because when you put into words what was previously hidden in the unconscious, you begin to weaken the power of that narrative. And perhaps someone reading your comment will realize they are not alone in this silent struggle. Now, there is something very important that needs to be clear. Changing your self-image doesn't mean creating an arrogant illusion about yourself. It's not about feigning superiority. It's not about denying vulnerabilities. It's about aligning your identity with your true human potential. Because often you live far below what you could truly experience simply because you have accepted a limited version of yourself. And this limitation doesn't always seem dramatic. Sometimes it appears in small details, in the way you present yourself, in the way you accept less than you deserve, in the way you give up too soon. Spirituality also speaks deeply about this. Several ancient traditions affirm that humankind has forgotten its own essence. It lives identified only with fear, ego, and conditioning. In Buddhism, there is the idea that much suffering arises from the illusory identification with thoughts and mental narratives. You believe you are your fears. You believe you are your failures. You believe you are your past pains. And then you lose touch with something much bigger within yourself, something conscious, something present, something that exists beyond the wounded identity. Perhaps that's why so many people feel a constant emptiness even when everything seems fine. Because deep down they are disconnected from their own essence. They live playing a character, created to survive, to please, or to be accepted. And there comes a time when the soul tires. That strange feeling arises of living a life that doesn't really seem like yours, as if something dormant wants to awaken. And usually this awakening begins precisely when you question your self-image for the first time. Science also reinforces this in impressive ways. Studies on neuroplasticity show that the brain is capable of continuously reorganizing itself. This means that your identity is not condemned to remain the same. New thoughts, new habits, and new emotional experiences literally reshape neural connections. In other words, transformation is possible, but it requires conscious repetition. It requires emotional consistency. It requires courage to sustain a new identity, even before it seems comfortable. And perhaps that is the greatest challenge of all. Hold on to the vision of who you want to become while your old mind tries to pull you back into familiar patterns. Because there will be times when acting differently will feel fake. There will be times when the insecurities will be overwhelming. Security will scream louder. There will be times when your old self tries to convince you that nothing has changed. But that's exactly where transformation happens. Not when everything seems easy, but when you decide to continue even without immediate validation. The truth is that your external life will hardly surpass for long what your self-image believes it deserves. You may even achieve something temporarily. But if your internal identity remains incompatible with it, sooner or later you will find a way to lose, sabotage, or abandon it. And this happens in all areas: money, love, health, purpose, emotional peace, everything. Because the mind seeks coherence between identity and reality. So perhaps the real question isn't how to change my life. Perhaps the correct question is, who do I need to believe I am to sustain the life I want to live? And this question completely changes the game, because it takes you out of the role of victim of circumstances and places you before the responsibility of consciously rebuilding your identity. In the end, self-image is like an invisible mirror projected onto reality. You don't just live what you want, you primarily live what you believe you deserve. And until you deeply understand this, you will continue trying to change the outside while keeping everything inside the same. But when this awareness awakens, something powerful happens. you slowly begin to recover parts of yourself that were buried under fear, guilt, and old conditioning. And perhaps today is exactly that moment for you. Perhaps this video didn't appear in your life by chance. Perhaps there's a version of you waiting for years to be born. A more conscious, freer, more whole version, but it can never exist as long as you continue to feed the identity created by the pains of the past. Because the past can explain who you have become, but it doesn't have to decide who you will be from now on. So the next time you look at yourself, try to see beyond the old narrative, beyond the failures, beyond the experiences that hurt you. Because there is a huge difference between carrying scars and transforming scars into identity. You are not only what you have lived, you are also what you choose to build from now on. And perhaps the greatest awakening is realizing that the reality you desire doesn't begin first in the external world. It begins quietly within the image you hold of yourself every day, because when that image truly changes, slowly, deeply, your entire life begins to change along with it.